Thank you. No conflict of interest to declare. I'll be breezing through why legal regulation is important for ART, who should regulate it, what are the issues that should be addressed by regulation, and I'll be talking about some examples of legal regulation of ART in Africa and outside Africa. And finally, I'll be suggesting a process for introducing and implementing regulation. So first of all, why is it important to regulate ART? Advances in technology pose a threat to our social norms and structure. Our ethics and morality are being eroded by some of these advances, and it is important for the law to keep up with these technological developments. Once there's a legal vacuum, then you begin to have proliferation of unethical practices, and that is not good for the present or future generations. I would say from the experience in the UK that legal regulation optimizes clinical outcomes while reducing wastage and complications. For example, in the UK, multiple pregnancy rate has dropped to about 6%. It was 3 times that only a few years ago, and that's thanks to legal regulation. And finally, I would say that we owe an obligation to future generations in the face of rapid advances in technology and ART. There are some factors that could influence the regulation of ART in any country. One of these is whether it's dominantly public or privately funded health service. If it's more of a public funded service, then it is easier to introduce, implement, and maintain legal regulation. Then there are issues of cost and cost effectiveness. So it does cost some money to implement robust legal regulation. There are issues relating to conflicts between what society deems to be in the overall interest of the community and the individual rights of the woman or couple. Religion also comes into it, and there are various factors that are sensitive as far as religion is concerned, and often you have conflict between those and the regulatory mechanism. And finally, there are lots of other laws that are not specific to ART, but which do affect ART. And these relate to professionalism, to clinical practice, and various other aspects of healthcare delivery. In the next couple of slides, I've listed some issues that will be addressed by any regulatory framework. Regulation of clinical and laboratory practice, regulation of research, regulation of consent requirements, eligibility for ART, issues relating to record keeping and data protection, reporting requirements, number of embryos to be transferred, sale or donation of embryos, surrogacy, importing and exporting embryos, cross-border reproductive health care, sex selection, welfare of the child, third-party reproduction and posthumous reproduction, selective fetal reduction, and so on. So these are some of the issues that call for regulation and which need to be addressed by any robust regulatory framework. Who conducts that regulation could vary. Professional self-regulation is one option. A government-appointed regulator is another. It could be an independent body, such as you have in the UK. And then there's a question mark whether it's going to be voluntary or mandatory. As my colleague Morad pointed out this morning, we are more likely to be successful if it is mandatory rather than voluntary regulation. The duty of the regulator will be to license clinics, to monitor treatment cycles, and to inspect facilities to make sure that these are consistent with the required standards. A model of good regulation is what we have in the United Kingdom. And if you look at this, you could see that's going from 1990, 1991, when HEFIA came into existence, that the regulator has tried as much as possible to keep pace with technological developments. And year on year, you find that the law is being adapted to meet with these changes. Look at 1993, social sex selection is banned. 2001, the law is updated to allow stem cell research. 2003, there's a new law to allow a man to be registered as the father of the child if the child has been born using his sperm. 2005, anonymity was removed, so people who are conceived with the help of a donor sperm can now find out who their parent or donor was. 2007, the EU Tissues and Cells Directives was implemented in the UK, and so on, right through to 2015, when the UK became the first country to legalize the use of mitochondrial donation techniques. So that's a good example of where the technology is advancing fast, but the regulatory framework is able to be dynamic and keep up with those changes, and the law is not falling behind. In India, in December last year, the Assisted Reproductive Technology Regulation Act was enacted, and this specified the establishment of a national registry of banks and clinics, National Assisted Reproductive Technology and Surrogacy Registry. And that act seeks to prevent the misuse and unsafe practice, proscribe the sale of embryos and gametes, and address child welfare issues. A similar act came earlier in Canada, and this Assisted Human Reproduction Act 2004 prescribes things relating to enforcement, issues of consent, reimbursement of costs, and safety issues. In the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, you have this booklet which gives a rundown of the laws and regulations in various countries within that geographical area, and that's available online if you want to see it. Coming to Africa, we have the National Health Act in South Africa, 2003. Chapter 8 relates to control of use of blood products, tissue, and gametes in humans. Now, one thing about this law is that it puts together things which in the UK would have under 2 or 3 different legislative acts. For example, things relating to blood put together with things relating to other tissue, and then gametes and IVF. So it's quite a lot within that chapter 8, and there are some aspects that you would normally fall under regulation of assisted reproductive technology, which is not in this chapter. But that's what we have in South Africa. And in Nigeria, there's the National Health Act of 2014. And here, the policymakers, legislators decide, well, no need to reinvent the wheel. So they just took chapter 8 of the South African Act and just plastered it on their own paper as part 6 of the National Health Act. So basically, it's a reproduction of what we have in the South African Act. These are good beginnings, but they are not good enough if we have to have robust legal regulation. So I've outlined here a process that could be good, that we could go through if we wish to introduce and implement regulation of ART in Africa. One effort was made in Nigeria some years ago, but it wasn't successful because all they did was lawyers sitting down with a few people to write out a draft bill, and it didn't go far. You've got to engage all stakeholders, and there has to be adequate consultation. I would suggest that the starting point would be having a working party to look into it, and that working party would drop a roadmap for how we're going to get to where we want to be with regulation. Then there'll be modalities worked out for funding the implementation of that roadmap, because as I said earlier, instituting regulation and maintaining it costs quite a bit of money. Having done that, you then go on to stakeholder consultations, and I'll give a list of such stakeholders shortly. Following those consultations, a working document is prepared, which synthesizes all the discussions, agreements, controversies, etc., from the stakeholder consultations. And on the basis of that, we can draft a bill. So that bill drafted by the legislative part of government undergoes further consultation. It is refined, and finally you have the enactment of a statute, and that will be the law that regulates ART in that particular country. And that law will usually include the establishment of a regulatory authority. So these are the stakeholders that would need to be consulted in devising a legal framework for regulating IVF. Service users, health professionals, government authorities and policy makers, civil society organizations, religious bodies, specialists in law and ethics, legislators, and the public at large. And these are the minimum requirements that will be set out in a legal framework. You've got to define who your stakeholders are, what type of regulation you want, the nature of the regulating authority, the licensing requirements and procedures. There has to be a code of practice, then funding arrangements, establishment of a registry, and then specific statutes on surrogacy, cross-border ART, and anonymity. And so I would challenge the EFSS and AFSS to set the ball rolling for legal implementation, for implementation of legal regulation in Africa. It's long overdue, and I know, certainly in my own country, Nigeria, that there are lots and lots of unethical practices that are allowed to prevail in the absence of legal regulation. So we need this desperately, and we have to do it through the proper means, in particular through the roadmap that I have outlined. So I did say that I would explain why it is important to regulate ART, who should regulate it, issues to be addressed by regulation, examples of legal regulation, and our situation here in Africa. And finally, suggested a process for introducing and implementing regulation. I believe I have done all that, but more importantly, I've thrown a challenge to the EFSS to take up this role of setting the ball rolling towards implementing legal framework for ART in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation about the present situation. And I hope the committee from the 4 countries will produce something soon for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Any questions, please? Okay, thank you.
Everyone is tired.